The organ was still playing when it happened. Cecily stood at the altar of St. Bartholomew's, Mayfair, in a veil borrowed from her uncle's wife and gloves too tight at the knuckle, and she told herself that this was simply what the end of one chapter felt like. The church smelled of beeswax and early autumn roses. The pews held 60 guests, most of them Sir Edmund's connections, a handful from Mr. Vane's trading interests, and in the third row on the right, because she had been placed precisely there by Lady Greyfield for reasons Cecily had not examined closely, sat Lady Sophia Hartwell in ice-blue silk, watching with the particular attention of a woman who considers herself adjacent to events that do not yet concern her. Cecily had not looked at the Earl of Calston. She had made a private decision about that 2 days ago, when the note was already written and folded, and she had already pressed it into the palm of the footman Thomas, with instructions to deliver it to the groom during the first hymn. She had told herself the note would change nothing. She had told herself she was only being honest, finally, after 3 months of being something else entirely. The first hymn ended. The vicar opened his book. Then Thomas moved. He stepped towards the groom from the transept corridor with the folded paper held low, discreet, the way a good footman moved, and Cecily watched him from the corner of her eye and felt the air in her chest turn to cold water. She had not expected the timing to be so precise. She had not truly expected any of this. Mr. Hadley Vane unfolded the note in his gloved hands. He read it once, and then he read it again. And then he was very still for a moment, in which the organ finished its coda, and the church entered a silence that had a particular quality Cecily had never heard before, the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake or a verdict. He said, "I cannot do this." He said it quietly, to the vicar, not to the congregation, though the church was old stone and old plaster, and it carried his voice to every corner without effort. The vicar said something low in return. The organ did not resume. The guests began, one by one, to look at one another, and then at the groom, and then at Cecily, who stood with her hands folded in front of her, and her face entirely, carefully, still. She did not look at the Earl of Calston. She did not look at anyone. She simply stood there in the borrowed veil, while the shape of her life rearranged itself around her. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not believed he would actually read it in time. The morning she turned 20 years old, Cecily had made a list. Not a list of hopes or wishes, or the kind of romantic inventory a young woman was supposed to keep in the privacy of her mind, but a practical reckoning. Her father had been dead for 3 weeks by then. The solicitor, Mr. Silas Pemberton, had come to the house at Aldecott to explain the terms of the will, and what he explained had taken some time because the terms were intricate and the result was not comfortable. The estate was entailed in a manner that left its administration to Sir Edmund Wren, her father's elder brother, until she married or reached the age of 23, at which point it would transfer permanently to Edmund if she remained unwed. The income from the estate in the interim would cover the household. The debt her father had accumulated in his final years, however, was Edmund's to manage, meaning Edmund's to leverage. She had not put any of this on her list. The list she made was simpler. Be useful. Do not ask for more than you could earn. Find a way to remain at Aldecott. That had been 2 years ago. In those 2 years, she had learned that being useful to Sir Edmund Wren meant being invisible to him, except when he required her to be visible, that his 2 younger daughters needed someone to instruct them in French and correspondence and the pianoforte, and that she was ideally suited to this purpose, and therefore ideally unsuited to being permitted to leave for a better situation. She had read every book in the Wren Library at Aldecott, and then every book in the lending library in the village, and she had walked the grounds in every weather, and she had written long letters to her father's old friend, Mrs. Bassett in Bath that she had no money to post more than twice a year. She had come to London for the season because Edmund had brought her, not because anyone had asked whether she wished to come. Edmund had been careful, in his letters to her, to frame the season as a generosity. London will do you good. You will meet people. At 22, you cannot afford another year without prospects. What he had not put in the letters was that he had already had a conversation with Mr. Hadley Vane, who was looking to marry a gentlewoman of good family for reasons of social advancement, and that this conversation had touched on the subject of a ward in need of a husband and an uncle in need of a certain sum to cover a certain debt of honor owed to certain men whose patience had been taxed beyond its natural limit. Edmund had not told her this because he knew she would object, and he was correct that she would have objected. He told her instead, when the season had passed its midpoint and she had not found a match of her own devising, that Vane was an admirable man, that the arrangement was sensible, that her feelings would follow her reason once she had accepted the common wisdom that love was a luxury for women with choices. She had stood in Edmund's study and kept her face perfectly still and thought about what it looked like, this moment, when the term of a ward's usefulness had arrived. She had not said yes precisely. She had not said no at all. She had simply not said enough no with sufficient clarity and force for the thing to stop. And in the machinery of the marriage market, the absence of no functioned identically to the presence of yes. The season had a particular quality that year, the autumn pressing early and gold against the windows of every drawing room, the last balls carrying a slight desperation as families calculated which matches had solidified and which would need another season's investment. Cecily moved through it in a cream gown that she had retrimmed twice and would not retrim a third time, and she carried a fan that had belonged to her mother, ivory-handled and painted with a scene from a Horace ode, and she was told with some frequency by Edmund's wife that she ought to smile more naturally. She watched the candlelight catch on other women's diamonds and rearranged the expression on her face, and thought about the pear trees at Aldercott, and whether anyone was properly attending to the kitchen garden. She noticed from the first week that the season had its own vocabulary of verdicts. A glance sustained half a second too long was a mark of interest. A glance withheld was its own pronouncement. The dowager set moved through the rooms like a tide, depositing eligible daughters on settees near eligible men, and the conversation that swirled above the tea tables had the quality of legal argument, evidence presented and weighed, dismissals rendered with the permanent efficiency of a court that never adjourned. The Earl of Calstone had arrived at the Pemberton card party in the second week of September with his daughter at his side, which was unusual, and which was accounted for by the fact that Harriet Greyfield had refused, with the particular iron will of a 4-year-old, to remain in the nursery that evening. The Earl had apparently decided this battle was not the one to fight. He stood at the edge of the drawing room with the child's hand in his, and the particular stillness that Cecily had already, without meaning to, begun to notice about him. The quality of a man who was always in the room but never entirely of it, who observed everything and committed to very little of what he observed. Dark brown hair worn back from a strong face. A faint silver scar at his left temple that caught the candlelight at certain angles. Dark gray eyes that moved across the room without settling on anything for long, until they settled on his daughter. And then the stillness in them changed. Harriet had begun to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet persistence of a child who was tired and overstimulated and had not been in a room this large since her mother died. Cecily was nearest. She acted before she thought. She sat down on the low chair beside the child and said, "There is a heron painted on my fan. Would you like to see it?" And Harriet, who had not been expecting a heron, stopped crying to look. She was not aware, in that moment, that the Earl was watching her. She was not aware of it for another 2 weeks either, because she was carefully not aware of it, the way one is carefully not aware of a source of heat in a cold room, because to acknowledge the warmth is to acknowledge how cold one was before it. He came to the Wren house on a Tuesday morning in late September on the pretext of returning a volume of Cowper's poems he had borrowed from Edmund at some earlier point. Edmund was not at home. His wife directed the Earl to the library, where Cecily was reading aloud to Harriet, who had been brought along by her nurse to call on Edmund's daughters, and had instead followed the sound of Cecily's voice. She did not hear him at the doorway. She was reading the Cowper, the passage about the quiet that surrounds a winter evening, and Harriet was sitting very still with her eyes wide and her dark curls escaping their ribbon. And it was only when she finished the page and looked up that she saw him standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame and an expression she could not name, something tight and precise and carefully leashed. "My lord," she said. "Miss Wren," he said. He looked at his daughter. "Harriet, I thought you were in the garden." "I was listening," Harriet said, with the unanswerable logic of the very young. He was quiet for a moment. "She reads to you often?" Harriet said, "Papa does not read to me anymore." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence in the church would be 6 weeks later. This one was interior, private, barely visible on his face except as a slight tightening around the eyes, a breath taken and released with extreme control, a stillness in the hands that she noticed because she had been watching them. She watched him receive this truth from his daughter's mouth, and she did not pretend she had not heard it. She did not flinch. She met his eyes for a moment with what she hoped was neither pity nor judgment, only acknowledgement. The simple recognition that the truth had been spoken and did not require management. He had been cold all season, and she had told herself that coldness meant nothing to her, and she had been wrong about that. And she knew it in this moment in the library doorway when she saw what the coldness was covering. He said after a moment, "I used to. I will again." He handed her the Cowper on his way out. Their fingers did not touch. She noticed anyway, with the part of her that she was carefully not using, that his were bare of a glove, and that the scar at his left temple was old and silver and faded into the hairline above his ear. If you have ever watched someone carry a grief, they will not put down. You will understand what she saw. If you have ever seen a man who has decided he does not deserve the ordinary softnesses of daily life, who wakes each morning and makes the same decision again, you will understand the quality of the expression he had worn since September in every public room. He had had a wife, and she had died in childbed 3 years past, and the infant had lived, and the mother had not. And what the Earl had decided in the months afterward was a private verdict she had only now, in the library doorway, begun to understand the weight of. She did not allow herself to dwell on it. She had her own practical mathematics to attend to. If you have ever stayed to the end of a story when no one made you, leave a word in the quiet below this one. This is a story that required staying. The season tightened toward October. Edmund grew impatient with what he called Cecily's wan manner around Vane, by which he meant that she spoke to Vane at dinners and danced with him at the required events, and had not yet produced the warmth he felt the occasion demanded. She tried to explain, privately, that warmth was not a tap to be turned. He told her she was thinking like a girl when she needed to think like a woman who understood her situation. At a dinner at the Marlowe house, Lady Greyfield arrived with Sophia Hartwell arranged at her right hand, like a piece of evidence. Sophia was 20 years old, and had the confidence of a woman who had been told since childhood that she was the correct answer to every question a man of quality might ask. She wore ice blue silk and pearls and diamonds at her throat, and she moved through the rooms with the unhurried ease of a person who has never had reason to calculate whether she was welcome. She was not unkind to Cecily. She was simply unaware of her in the particular way of people who do not recognize competition when it is dressed plainly. Lady Greyfield said, when the ladies had retired and Cecily was nearest to her at the far end of the drawing room, in a voice that carried precisely as far as she intended it to carry, "One feels for the girl, a ward and nothing more, with a face that might do better if she had the money to put behind it." She said it to Sophia, who smiled with careful blankness, and to Lady Fareham beside her, who had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. Lady Greyfield snapped her fan half open and made no further observation. Cecily stood with her back very straight and heard every syllable and moved to the window as though she had been planning to all along. The Earl was not in that room. He was with the gentleman and could not have heard it. She was not certain, even then, that she wished him to have heard it. What she knew was that the days were narrowing. The wedding date had been set for the 14th of October. Edmund had told her this with the satisfaction of a man who has closed a ledger. She had 4 weeks. Vane had signed an agreement Edmund had drawn up, and she had not been shown. She was 22 years old, and the estate at Aldercott was counting down its days of belonging to her family, and she had, in the end, done nothing of sufficient consequence to stop it, except that she had not yet done the one thing she was still capable of doing. She wrote the note on the 11th of October at the small writing table in her room at the Wren House in Mayfair at 11 o'clock in the evening when the household was quiet. She did not draft it. She had been composing it in her head for 4 days, and she knew what it needed to say, and she knew there was only one register in which to say it, which was the plain one. She wrote, "Mr. Vane, I am writing this because I believe you are a man who would wish to know the truth, and because I do not know of another way to tell it to you in time. This match was arranged without my consent by my uncle, who is owed money by a certain party connected to you. I have not told you this because I did not think it would matter to you, and I may be wrong now. If I am wrong, you may discard this note, and I will marry you tomorrow as agreed, and I will keep faith with the marriage, as well as I am able. If you are the man I believe you might be, I ask only that you consider whether you wish to enter a marriage your bride entered under coercion. I do not ask for rescue. I ask only for your conscience. It is the only honest thing I have left to offer. C. Wren." She folded it. She held it for a long time. She had written it in the plainest language she could find, because she had learned, in 2 years in Edmund's house, that plain language was the only kind that could not be reinterpreted. Sentiment could be dismissed as feeling. Argument could be outmaneuvered with experience. Plain language was simply a thing said, and either it was received or it was not. She had no other tools. Then she pressed it into her mother's old prayer book for safekeeping, and she went to bed. And she lay awake until 4 in the morning, thinking about what it meant to act honestly in a situation where honesty had come rather late. The morning of the 14th, she dressed in the borrowed veil and her mother's gloves, and she gave the note to Thomas with quiet, specific instructions. Her hands did not shake. She was 22 years old, and she had been practicing stillness for 2 years, and it had finally produced something useful. She stood at the altar, and she told herself the note would change nothing. She had made the attempt. It would not be enough. And then it was. What followed the cancellation was not silence, so much as a controlled detonation. Edmund was on his feet almost before Vane had finished speaking. He reached the aisle in 4 strides his face deeply florid, and he said something low and precise into Vane's ear that Cecily could not hear. And Vane said, audibly, "I am aware of what I am doing, Sir Edmund." He said it without heat, with the simple weight of a man who has arrived at a decision and does not require debate. He handed the note to the footman, looked briefly at Cecily with an expression she could only describe as dignified apology, and walked out of the church. Edmund turned on her. She could see, in the clarity that arrives when everything has already gone wrong, that he was not going to absorb this defeat quietly. He took her arm. He said, in a voice careful enough to be heard by the pews nearest the aisle, "You will come home." She did. Because she had not been wrong when she thought the note would not be enough. The cancellation was not deliverance. It was merely a different kind of confinement. He came to her room that evening. Not violently, not dramatically, in the way that cruelties in well-furnished houses so rarely are. He came and stood in the doorway in his dark green coat and his yellow waistcoat and his self-possessed certainty, and he said that she would remain in the house, that he had already sent word to Vane that the situation was a misunderstanding of no lasting weight, that a special license could be obtained within the week, and that if she continued to make herself difficult, he would be forced to inform any party who inquired that her conduct had been erratic and unsuitable for respectable company. He stood in the doorway, and he said, "You are a ward, and nothing more, Cecily. You have no resources, no connections, no credit of your own. I am the sum total of your circumstances." She said nothing. She sat at her writing table with her hands flat on the surface, and she let him finish. What she was thinking was that she had spent 4 days writing that note, and 2 years writing nothing that mattered, and that she still had no plan at all. The following morning, Edmund's housemaid told her, while bringing the breakfast tray, that Miss Harriet had not come for her Tuesday lesson. That Lady Greyfield had sent a note to Sir Edmund requesting that the arrangement be concluded, given the unsettled circumstances. That Harriet would no longer be coming for lessons until the matter was resolved. Cecily ate her toast. She poured her tea. She held her cup with both hands because the morning was cool, and she was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She thought about Harriet's dark curls and the escaped ribbon, and the way the child had looked at her when she said there was a heron on the fan. With a complete and wholehearted arrival into the moment that only very young children and very old people manage, she heard 2 of Edmund's guests speaking in the corridor outside her room. She caught only one clear phrase, delivered by a woman she did not know, in the tone of gentle pity that was the cut's most refined form. Well, she was a ward, and nothing more, was she not? One wonders what she expected. The words passed through her, the way cold water passes through an open hand. That evening, Edmund informed her that she would be accompanying him to dinner at the Greyfield estate. He said this was not a choice. He said her disappearance from society for more than 2 days would cause precisely the kind of talk he was trying to prevent. He said Lord Calston had graciously continued the invitation, even in light of the recent unpleasantness, which he found encouraging. She dressed in the cream gown. She wore her mother's gloves. She did not know what she expected from the evening. She expected, she supposed, to endure it. She did not expect the Earl to be waiting. The Greyfield dining room held the length of a long table set for 20, candelabra at intervals casting warm light that shifted slightly when the doors opened, and she entered on Edmund's arm with 40 eyes in the room and 40 opinions already formed, and she kept her face exactly as still as she had learned to keep it. And she found her place card. And she sat. The room was the kind of room that had accumulated its comfort across generations, dark wood warmed by firelight, walls hung with portraits whose subjects looked out at the living with the settled patience of people who have outlasted several fashions. She straightened her gloves. She arranged her expression. Lady Greyfield was at the far end. Sophia was at Alistair's right. He was at the head of the table, and he had not looked at Cecily since she came in. And she had not looked at him. And the soup was served. And the fish course followed. And the conversation around her was careful, and slightly too animated with the effort of not discussing the cancelled wedding. And Edmund was 2 seats away talking with the careful confidence of a man who believes he still controls the situation. She watched the candlelight move across the tablecloth, and she thought about what it would mean to spend the week between now and the special license waiting for a door to remain unlocked. It was during the remove, between the lamb and the jellies, that Lord Calston set down his fork. He set it down with a small, clear sound that carried further than it should have in the room's particular acoustics, and the conversation nearest him paused in the way conversation pauses when the most significant person in the room has ceased doing what they were doing. He said, "Mr. Pemberton, you are present tonight, I believe." Mr. Silas Pemberton, 3 seats down on the left, said, "I am, my lord." "The estate at Aldercott," Lord Calston said. "The terms of the Wren Trust. Are they as I understand them to be?" Pemberton looked briefly at Edmund, and then at the Earl, and made the swift calculation of a man whose professional judgment has been directly addressed. "The estate transfers to the ward's control upon marriage, or upon attaining the age of 23, he said. "Until that point, the administration rests with Sir Edmund Wren. And if the ward were to marry within the week," Lord Calstone said, "the administration would transfer immediately." Edmund had gone very still. "It would," Pemberton said. Lord Calston turned his head. He looked down the table, past the candelabra and the flowers and the 20 intervening faces, and he found Cecily where she sat with her hands in her lap, and her face perfectly composed, and her heart doing something entirely unreasonable beneath her ribs. He said, "Miss Wren will be my countess, not his bride." The room did not breathe. Edmund said, "My lord, I must protest," and his voice had the register of a man who knows he has already lost, but has not yet fully arrived at the fact. "You may protest," Lord Calstone said, in the level tone he used for everything. "Mr. Pemberton will advise you whether your protest has legal standing, given that Miss Wren has not consented to the Vane arrangement, and that her written retraction of consent exists and is dated. I will speak with you after dinner." Lady Greyfield had gone very quiet at the far end of the table, the kind of quiet that precedes a recalibration. Sophia was looking at the table before her with an expression that was almost entirely gracious, and contained, at its edges, the specific grief of a woman who had been told she was the correct answer, and has just learned the question was different than she thought. She pressed her lips together once, and then she smoothed them, and she reached for her wine-glass, with a steadiness that Cecily could only recognize as character. Edmund said nothing else. He picked up his fork. He was going to make it through this dinner on the scaffolding of his dignity, because it was all he had left, and he was the kind of man who understood the value of scaffolding. Cecily looked at the Earl. He was looking at her. His face had the quality she had noticed in the library doorway, that tightness that was not coldness, that leashed and careful thing. There was something else in it now, something that had crossed the distance from the doorway to this table, from the library to the church to the dining room. And she thought he had been waiting to say that for some time. She did not speak. She did not trust, in that moment, what would come out if she opened her mouth. He said, quietly, for her alone, "I should have said it 3 weeks ago. I have been a coward." She said, "I wrote a note." He said, "I know." And something shifted in his face. barely visible, the corner of his mouth moving slightly in a way that was almost, for one moment, something like amusement. She had the distinct sensation of the room settling around her into a shape she did not yet know the dimensions of, but which had, for the first time in 2 years, room to breathe. Mr. Pemberton did speak to Edmund after dinner. Whatever he said had the character of a conversation from which only one party could emerge with any useful result. Edmund left early. His wife said the appropriate things to the appropriate people with the practiced fluency of a woman who has spent 30 years managing the aftermath of her husband's decisions, and she did not return to speak to Cecily. What remained was the drawing room, and the fire, and 20 people rearranging themselves in the new topography the evening had produced. Lord Calston came to stand beside her at the window. The evening was dark beyond the glass, and the candlelight behind them made a mirror of it, and she could see his reflection and her own standing at a proper distance that was nevertheless the closest they had stood without another person between them. She was aware of his hand near hers on the windowsill, not touching, deliberate in its near approach, as though he were showing her rather than telling her what he intended. "Harriet asks after you," he said. "She wanted to bring the fan with the heron tonight. I told her it was not hers to bring." "It is hers if she wants it," Cecily said. "I should like her to have it." He was quiet for a moment. She would be glad of someone who reads to her, consistently. He paused. "I would try to do better at it. I have not been reliable in that regard." She turned to look at him properly. "I know why." "I know you do," he said. "That is part of why I could not leave you to Vane." She said, "That is not the only part." It was the most direct thing she had said to him in the whole of the season, and the air between them changed slightly, the way air changes when something that has been withheld is finally released. He said, "No, it is not." The rest of the evening passed the way evenings pass, when everything of consequence has already been said, and both parties are still learning the new shape of their proximity. Cecily was returned to the Wren house in the Earl's carriage, because Edmunds had left early, and there was no other arrangement. She sat across from Lady Greyfield's companion, who had been dispatched as chaperone with the efficiency of a household that knew how to produce propriety on short notice, and she held her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the gas-lit streets of Mayfair, and thought, with a quality of wonder she did not entirely know what to do with, that she had written a note to the wrong man, and it had reached the right one. The arrangements that followed were the business of solicitors and the careful management of Edmund's bruised position, which Pemberton handled with the same quiet competence he had brought to explaining the terms of the will 2 years before. The Vane agreement was dissolved. The estate at Aldecott was confirmed in the terms of the trust. The engagement between Cecily and Alistair Greyfield, Earl of Calston, was announced in the Morning Post on the 22nd of October, which was, as she noted privately, 11 days before her name would have appeared in entirely different circumstances. Lady Greyfield required some days to absorb the new arrangement. She was not unkind. She was precise and accustomed to being the architect of the people around her, and the dining room had been a recalibration she had not planned for. She came to call at the Wren house on the 25th, with Sophia beside her, and she sat across from Cecily in the drawing room, and said, with the measured honesty of a woman who respects demonstrated quality even when it has arrived inconveniently, that Harriet was very fond of her, and that she supposed they would manage. Sophia said, looking at Cecily with a clarity that was entirely unperformed, "I hope you will be happy, Miss Wren. I think perhaps he has been waiting for someone who was not looking for what he had." It was the most honest sentence anyone had spoken to Cecily in 3 months. She said, "I was not looking for anything. I was trying to survive a particular situation." Sophia smiled, briefly, with a sadness that was genuine and not without grace. "I know," she said. "That is precisely what I mean." If you have never stood in the hall of a house that is about to become yours, you may not know the particular quality of that moment, the way the proportions of every room seem slightly altered, not larger exactly, but more present, as though the walls have decided to take you seriously. Cecily stood in the front hall of Calstone House on the 28th of October, having arrived to take tea with Harriet and Lady Greyfield, and she felt the quality of the house around her. It was an old house, not fashionable, built for living in rather than for being seen in, with corridors that turned unexpectedly, and windows that let in more light than the London standard permitted, and she felt it deciding something about her. Harriet came down the staircase at a speed slightly inconsistent with what her nurse had asked of her, in a pale yellow dress with a white pinafore, and her dark curls mostly escaped from their ribbon, and she stopped at the bottom step and said, "You came." "I said I would," Cecily said. "Papa said you would come even if he got the time wrong because you are reliable," Harriet said, with the precision of a child reporting information whose significance she had accurately assessed. Cecily looked up. Alistair was at the top of the stair, in a dark coat, and he was looking at her with that careful expression she was learning to read, the one that meant considerably more than it showed. She said, "He said that, did he?" "He said other things too," Harriet said, "but he said those were private." The tea that afternoon lasted longer than it had any practical reason to last, and Harriet fell asleep in the library chair with the Cowper poems open on her lap, and the fire burned low, and outside the windows of Calstone House the first frost of October settled on the iron railings and the stone steps and the bare branches of the plane trees along the street, and Cecily sat across from him in the firelight and said very little, and found that very little was required. They had the particular ease of two people who have already conducted their courtship in a library doorway and a dining room and a window reflection and a note written in plain language at 11 o'clock at night. They did not need to work to be in the same room. They had already done that work in a way neither of them had quite acknowledged doing. At some point in the quiet, she noticed his left hand resting on the arm of the chair, and that the breast pocket of his coat had a slight irregularity, a thickness that did not belong to a coat lining. She said, "What do you keep in your pocket?" He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, small and slightly worn at the crease, and set it on the table between them. She recognized her own handwriting on the fold. She looked at it for a long moment. The note. Not a copy. The original. The one she had written at the small table by candlelight. That she had pressed into the prayer book. That she had given to Thomas. That Thomas had given to the groom. She had assumed Vane took it when he left the church. She understood now that Thomas had not given it to Vane at all. That Thomas had given it, at some point in the confusion of the church, to the Earl who had been nearest, who had been watchful, as he always was. She looked up. "You read it," she said. "Thomas gave it to me when Vane returned it through him," he said. "I was nearest. Thomas knew, I think, what he was doing." She looked at the note on the table between them. She thought about the 11 o'clock quiet of the small writing table in her room, the way the words had come out plain, the long, careful draft of 2 years of endurance that had produced them. She said, "I wrote it for him." "I know," he said. "Every line of it was you, though. The plainest account of a person I have read." She looked up at him. He said, "I should like to keep it, if you are willing." She thought about the estate at Aldercott, where the pear trees were dropping their last fruit by now, where the library held the books her father had annotated in the margins, where the kitchen garden was going to seed without proper attention. She thought about Harriet, asleep in the library chair with the Cowper poems on her lap, her dark curls on the cushion, her small chest rising and falling. She thought about a house whose proportions took you seriously, and a man who had been carrying a grief for 3 years and was slowly, carefully, deciding to put it down. She said, "Keep it then." Outside, the frost on the railings caught the light from the street lamps and held it, and the house was quiet around them, and Harriet breathed softly in the library chair, and the fire burned down to coals. And it was not the life she had listed at 20 on the morning after her father's death, but it was something considerably better than endurance. The note stayed in his pocket. He kept it there. She found it again, years later, still folded at the original crease, still worn at the edges where he had unfolded and refolded it more times than a person does with something they only read once. She did not ask him about it a second time. She already knew the answer, and some answers are better kept folded, pressed close, carried quietly forward into a life that had finally, improbably, made room for her. Thank you for staying until the end. If something in Cecily's plain, honest note moved you, leave a word below and stay close for the next story.